Hello, welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson and I am a professor of English at Stanford University. This episode will be focusing on CHINUA ACHEBE's Arrow of God and what it tells us of the malaise of colonial modernity. Unlike Things Fall Apart, Arrow of God is set among the Igbo of Eastern Nigeria in the early part of the 20th century, when the colonial bureaucracy has been fully established and is not simply incipient as in the earlier novel. We are introduced to Ezeulu, the Chief Priest of Ulu, among the people of Umuaro. But unlike what we saw in Things Fall Apart, the traditional culture here is full of disagreements and quarrels about everything, even including the foundational narratives of the clan. In the midst of this is placed Ezeulu, who as a chief priest is also afflicted by doubts about his sphere of social action within the context of the historical changes that has taken place in his clan. I will be arguing that Ezeulu's crisis is part of the malaise that comes with colonial modernity. For colonial modernity is not simply the historical phase of new infrastructure, colonial bureaucracy, and alternative modes of self-fashioning brought on by Christianity, but that colonial modernity also serves to ambiguate traditional attitudes regarding people's collective pasts. It is this ambiguation that leads to a sense of confusion and malaise, and that in the novel is depicted vividly through the mind of Ezeulu. As is well known, colonial modernity triggered major historical transformations for colonized societies in Africa and elsewhere. In his essay, Modern Social Imaginaries, the philosopher Charles Taylor defines modernity as historically unprecedented amalgam of new practices and institutional forms, science, technology, production, urbanization, of new ways of living, individualism, secularization, instrumental rationality, and of new forms of malaise, alienation, meaninglessness, and a sense of impending social dissolution. As we shall see shortly, Arrow of God captures the sense of malaise produced by the contradictions of colonial modernity. As important as the shared elements of European and colonial modernity may have been, even more significant were the socio-structural contradictions unleashed with the introduction of formal colonialism from the 1850s onwards, where there was a differential emphasis on race and class relations, a blatant denigration of the cultures of local populations, the privileging of sedentarism over nomadism, and the overall incoherence of the steady co-optation of local traditional elites into the bureaucratic apparatus throughout the entire period leading up to independence in the 1960s. The most important effect of these historical transformations of colonial modernity is that it triggers ambiguous responses to collective history. This is discernible on at least two interrelated levels. First is that the transition often proliferates epistemological aporia or gaps, and generates problems of interpretation regarding the pastness of the past and its significance for the present. While everyone may agree that the past is indeed past, there is no necessary agreement on how past it really is and what consequences the past then holds for the present. The past becomes an ambiguous prologue to the present. Second is the ambivalence that comes to bear upon the status of moral judgment and how this relates to ethically significant choice making, whether of a heroic or everyday kind. We have already discussed the domain of ethical choice making in our episode on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and it will be good to bear that in mind as you watch this episode. Under colonial modernity, whereas moral judgment may have appeared predictable and the epic code secure, the process of transition progressively puts these in doubt. The effect of collective or individual ambivalence with respect to the past is that it renders the underlying cultural codes either no longer entirely relevant or makes them seem subservient to inherently narrow or unrepresentative principles. Other sites and cultural modalities may then appear equally pertinent to moral judgment and heroic action, and the apparent attractiveness of contrasting models of action engenders confusion in the minds of those contemplating any form of action in the first place. In the Western literary tradition, the ambiguation of responses to a collective past gains thematic prominence from the end of the 19th century onwards. It is also a key mark of modernity. When Eliot's Prufrock laments that he has measured out his life in coffee spoons, the coffee spoons also serve as the measures by which the banal ritual accoutrements of bourgeois life are connected to his sense of growing inauthenticity and alienation. Despite his desire to push the moment to its crisis, he also recognizes the inescapable compromise wrought by his thorough assimilation to the rituals of the social group he ponders unsettling. In this existential conundrum, he joins a long tradition in Western literature, anticipated much earlier by Shakespeare's Hamlet and Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and followed rapidly in the 19th century by memorable characters in Ibsen, Chekhov, Dostoevsky, Kafka, Conrad, Beckett, and several others for whom the possibility of authentic action is usurped by ambiguous responses to individual and collective pasts and the surrounding banality of the social life world. These ambiguations find their counterparts in many works of African literature. In the literature pertaining to the alienations of modernity, the uncertainty with respect to producing an account of the self in an ambivalent relationship to the past is depicted first and foremost as a problem within the consciousness of the central character. The impossibility of separating truth from falsehood and action from moral judgment is shown as interposing insurmountable questions in the mind of the individual protagonist. This also has implications for the kind of narration in which such individuals are depicted, such that the narration is full of stops and starts, digressions and diversions, and is populated with devices projected from an anxious mental sphere and outward. The stream of consciousness method in most such novels registers these difficulties as problems for the narration. The narrative elements I have just enumerated coalesce quite strongly in the work of several African writers such as Aikwe Ama, Teyib Saleh, on whom we already have an episode, Yvonne Vera, Ama Ata Edu, Dambujo Marachera, Christopher Okigbo, Athol Fugard, and J.M. Coetzee, among various others. Given the largely urban, bourgeois, or sub-aristocratic settings in which alienation has hitherto been explored in both Western and African literature, one question that we have to ponder is whether a rural setting also allows for the exploration of the thematic of alienation as such. Can a rural dweller brought up on assured ritual practices and the predictable flow of social relationships also experience a form of existential alienation? Achebe provides the best answer from an Africanist perspective with Arrow of God, which is a true sequel to Things Fall Apart, but different in many ways. Like the earlier novel, Arrow of God also has a largely rural setting, but the story is placed in a period of colonial encounters in eastern Nigeria, somewhat later than what we saw in the first novel, as I've already mentioned. And yet, Arrow of God is dramatically different from Things Fall Apart. This can readily be seen from comparing this episode to the one on Things Fall Apart we saw a few weeks ago. To Umuofia's unanimism is set Umuaro's lack of communal consensus. In place of Okonkwo, a man, we are told, who was well known throughout the 9 villages and beyond, as we saw on the very first page of Things Fall Apart, is contrasted Ezeulu, the chief priest of Ulu, who, though also well known throughout the 6 tribes that make up the clan of Umuaro, is from the start of the novel met with a mixture of reluctant respect and uncomprehending disdain by his own people. And the chief priest does not love them unconditionally either. It is the way in which Arrow of God thematizes transition and assimilates its vagaries to the consciousness of Ezeulu that registers the novel as a supreme example of existentialist literature in the terms we described earlier. The very opening of the novel introduces a motif that comes to have a peculiarly ambiguous resonance as the narrative unfolds. This is the motif of the moon, which we find Ezeulu staring at when we first encounter him. And this is what we see. This was the 3rd nightfall since he began to look for signs of the new moon. He knew it would come today, but he always began his watch 3 days early because he must not take a risk. In this season of the year, his task was not too difficult. He did not have to peer and search the sky as he might do when the rains came. Then the new moon sometimes hid itself for days behind rain clouds, so that when it finally came out, it was already half grown. And while it played its game, the chief priest sat up every evening waiting. This new moon is interpreted in 5 different ways over the course of the next 2 pages. First, it is described by the narrator, focusing the remark as a thought of Ezeulu himself, as being as thin as an orphan fed grudgingly by a cruel foster mother. Outside his Obi, Matefi, his senior wife, who has also, with others in the compound, been looking up at the sky, asks what its face meeting mine might bring good fortune. But Ugoye, the younger wife, while invoking the same prayer, pauses to add that she does not like how the moon is setting. We then see Obiageli, Ugoye's daughter, asking plaintively whether the moon kills people, while she tugs persistently at her mother's cloth, almost stripping her naked. A small quarrel erupts between her and her older brother Mwafu, and the entire scene comes to a modulated ending in a song devised by the little girl. For, as we are endearingly informed, Obiageli turned everything into song. In this opening segment, the moon is first seen as eliciting a sacred hermeneutic, the key of which is held by the chief priest alone. And yet, the power of interpretation is not left to him by himself, as we see from the domesticated interpretative maneuvers invested in each of the characters we encounter over the first 2 pages of the novel. In much of the novel, Ezeulu's peering at the moon is linked at once to his interpretation of the historical role and significance of his priesthood. But later on, however, we are given a passing yet highly significant counterpoint in his own mind that helps raise new questions about its status inside of the priest's consciousness. This quite different and subtle perspective is attached to the memory of his dead mother. In a dream that he has after he returns from detention at Okweri at the hands of the colonial administration, and when he's contemplating what punishment to visit on his people for slighting him and not accompanying him to the colonial headquarters. One night, Ezeulu is startled from a dream by the demented laughter of a singer at a funeral procession close to his compound. And this is what we see. The voice of the burial party had since disappeared in the distance. But beside the sorrow of the solitary voice that now wailed after them, they might have been returning with their bride. The sweet agony of the solitary singer settled like dew on the head. I was born when lizards were in ones and twos, a child of Idemili. The difficult teardrops of sky's first weeping dew my spots. Being skyborn, I walked the earth with royal gait, and mourners saw me coil across their path. But of late, a strange bell has been ringing a song of desolation. Leave your yams and cocoyams and come to school. and I must scuttle away in haste when children in play or in earnest cry, "Look, a Christian is on the way." The singer's sudden, demented laughter filled Ezeulu's compound and he woke up. In spite of the cold harmattan, he was sweating, but he felt an enormous relief to be awake and know that it had been a dream. The blind alarm and the life and death urgency fell away from it at the threshold of waking. But a vague fear remained because the voice of the python had ended as the voice of Ezeulu's mother when she was seized with madness. Nwanyi Operi, as they called her in Umuaro, had been a great singer in her youth, making songs for her village as easily as some people thought. In later life, when her madness came on her, these old songs and others she might have made forced themselves out in eccentric spurts through the cracks in her mind. Ezeulu, in his childhood, lived in fear of these moments when his mother's feet were put in stocks at the new moon. A number of motifs undergo subtle metamorphosis here. The song in the dream, clearly attributed to the sacred python, that we will already have encountered earlier in the novel, registers both its sacred genealogy as a child of the sky and its imminent demise because of the coming to dominance of the Christians. What is startling, however, is how on waking Ezeulu proceeds to first conflate the voice of the singer with that of the python itself, and then by a process of free association with that of his own mother from long ago. Additionally, there is also a subtle process of interpsychic transfer of the sacred awe that attaches to the python onto his mother, even though to Ezeulu's waking consciousness, this is encapsulated in the mixed registers of relief and residual dread. More significantly, it is also at this point that he recalls the fact that his mother was put in the stocks on the appearance of the new moon, something that as a child made him live in constant terror and dread. From this passage, we see that the moon carries an affective load for Ezeulu that goes well beyond its place as the object of sacred interpretation. Rather, its changing face in the sky is entangled in his consciousness with the ebb and flow of his mother's insanity, something that clearly gives him great fear and distress both as an adult and a child. The association of his mother's insanity with the changing faces of the moon proleptically looks forward to the onset of Ezeulu's own madness toward the end of the novel. However, and perhaps more significantly, from the perspective of how a sense of alienation is subliminally registered in his consciousness, the sacred fear he exhibits with respect to the moon is deeply intermeshed with another and more atavistic fear, and that is the terror of having to bear witness to his mother's insanity and the capacity to interpret the moon as a sacred object. The novel does not reflect the thematic of ambiguation exclusively through Ezeulu's consciousness, but also locates it at the interface of the relationship between epistemology and history. Rumors, gossip, and foundational narratives, and how these imply contradictory attitudes toward epistemology and history serve to further consolidate a problematic of modernity. The novel literally swirls with rumors and gossip. These rumors and gossip in Arrow of God give us insight into the surreptitious perceptions that people have of Ezeulu, that his wives have of each other, and that the folk in the tribe have of the white man, and vice versa. As we saw in our episode on Jim Reese's White Sargasso Sea, Arrow of God also suggests that rumors and gossip are first and foremost disciplinary instruments, in the sense that the characters use these to devise a moral cartography of others' behavior, and, more consequently, that such rumors and gossip are prefaces to various courses of action. Intersecting with rumors and gossip are a number of foundational narratives in the novel. Though these narratives are also ultimately disciplinary, they are analytically distinguishable from rumors and gossip in that they appear to require specific forms of assent with regard to their truth value. Their truth value, as we see from the novel, is tied to notions of heroic action. And yet, whereas the elusive veracity of rumors and gossip does not seem to generate any difficulty in procuring assent toward the opinions they express or the actions deriving therefrom, the foundational narratives we are presented with suffer from a debilitating skepticism. The most crucial of these foundational narratives is without a doubt the one that is depicted of the elders meeting early in the novel. The male elders of Umuaro meet to debate whether to go to war with the people of Operi, who have mischievously, in their eyes, come to lay claim to a piece of land bordering the two communities that had hitherto not been the object of any disagreement. At this meeting, Ezeulu recounts the story that his father had told him as a child about how the six tribes had come together to collectively create the god Ulu, with the weakest tribe among them nominated by the others to be the custodian of this new synthetic deity. As a descendant of Priest of Ulu, he cautions that his God is not one to fight an unjust war, because as his father told him, the land had always belonged to Operi. To this piece of measured rhetoric is counterposed that of Nwaka, a lord of the land who has taken the highest title, Eru, which was called after the Lord of Wealth himself. Nwaka opens his speech with a proverb that, unlike what we have come to expect from reading things for the part, is designed not to affirm unanimity, but to inscribe radical difference. Wisdom is like a goatskin bag. Every man carries his own. Knowledge of the land is like that. Ezeulu has told us what his father told him about the olden days. We know that a father does not speak falsely to his son, but we also know that the law of the land is beyond the knowledge of many fathers. This extraordinary opening is only the preamble to a story that is in every detail opposed to the one that Ezeulu has just recounted. In Nwaka's account, the people of Operi could not possibly have owned the land in question, since historically they were driven away first from Umuofia, then from Abame, and subsequently from Aninta. It is only after many upheavals that they came to settle near Umuaro. By insisting that Operi had been driven away from not one but several locations, Nwaka raises a dramatic distinction between nomadic and sedentary peoples. In his account, as nomadic peoples, the Operi are nothing but wandering strangers, and thus cannot have any claim to a land settled by a sedentary people such as their own, the Umuarans. The only reason they now make bold to claim the disputed land, Nwaka adds, is because the white man has established his headquarters at Operi. This last point is also a historical interpolation, introducing the presence of colonialism that is not reflected in Ezeulu's account of what his father told him. Since each account is a goatskin bag and therefore incapable of objective verification, the only means of ascertaining their truth content is through the horizon of ideology. The binary distinctions that undergird the differences between the two men, priest versus self-made man, tradition versus individual talent, serves to underscore the fact that the two of them are actually proffering mutually exclusive stories about their collective past. The radical ambiguity regarding the communal past, here located in two contrasting narratives about the foundation of the clan, gains further ramification at different levels of the text. That gossip and rumor possess readier assent as of actionable value, as opposed to the foundational narratives of the clan, hints at the fact that the transition produced by the colonial encounter has succeeded also in reconfiguring epistemological narrative categories within the clan. In the terms first set out by Raymond Williams in Marxism and Literature, we see how Achebe is giving free play to both dominant and residual cultural categories. He does this in such a way as to simultaneously suggest a discursive inversion, that is to say, the dominant foundational tales appear dubious, while rumors and gossip retain believability, and also an affirmation of the order of things. That is to say, it is the foundational narratives that are the subject of deliberative exchange for the political laws of the clan, while gossip and rumor retain their salience largely at the level of the domestic sphere. The simultaneity of inversion and affirmation then encapsulates the ambiguity of transition located at the intersection of both content and form. There are several important distinctions to be seen between Things Fall Apart and Arrow of God. The first and most significant is what I have alluded to already, namely that whereas Okonkwo's world is largely unanimist, Ezeulu's is agonistic and full of debate. The other significant difference is that the events in Things Fall Apart are set in a period when colonialism is only incipient, and represents the era of the early appearance and establishment of white colonial authority. In contrast to the first novel, in Arrow of God, colonialism is already firmly entrenched, with the colonial authorities already having a headquarters at Okperi, the town at the heart of the quarrel with the people of Umuaro we see at the start of the novel. There is also the firm presence of the Christian church, which apart from other things, provides different pathways for the fulfillment of aspirations toward independent self-expression within the new colonial bureaucratic apparatus. But perhaps the most important distinction is that in Arrow of God, we find that the mind of the central character is a theater for debates about a range of things, including his own alienation from his people. Several times in the novel, we are shown Ezeulu debating the extent of his sphere of action as the Chief Priest of Ulu, and a concomitant sense of doubt about his position and what it might entail in the context of changing historical circumstances. The proverb he tells one of his sons on dispatching him to the Christian school to act as his father's eyes and ears turns out to be entirely appropriate to Ezeulu himself. The world is like a mask dancing. You cannot see it properly by standing still. Thank you very much. Please remember to consult the reading suggestions on the novel in the episode description below. And if you like this episode, remember to give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.